Right. So I think we're ready to go here. And hello, everyone out there in Facebook world or YouTube or wherever you might be watching this. And welcome here from Indiana Public Broadcasting. Tonight we're going to have a conversation about difficult conversations. A conversation about conversations, what they are, why they're important, and how we can have them. And so our premise for this conversation was this year we had this election, we had protests, we had a pandemic, and it's put a spotlight on divisions between loved ones and within communities. So with the holidays approaching, how can you prepare yourself to have thoughtful conversations with friends, family, or anyone who has a different viewpoint from your own? And are there topics that maybe should be avoided? So we have a panel here of experts on conversation, and we're going to kind of introduce them one by one in no particular order. Let's go first with J.R. Jamison. So J.R. is the co-founder of the Facing Project and the co-host of the Facing Project radio show on Indiana Public Radio. The Facing Project is a nonprofit that creates a more understanding and empathetic world through sharing stories that inspire action. He's also the author of Hillbilly Queer, which will be released in 2021. Thanks, J.R. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah. Next, we also have Anthony Murdock. He is the founder of Murdock LLC. He's a purpose-driven, action-oriented servant leader and proud product of Indianapolis, Indiana. He's a JD candidate at the IU McKinney School of Law, founder of Murdock LLC, and co-founder of Power Moves Only, Inc. Ultimately, Murdock is in the business of becoming the greatest powerpreneur Indianapolis has ever seen. And he's also a huge fan of the Boston Celtics, a member of Eastern Star Church, and a hip-hop scholar enthusiast. Hey, Murdock, how you doing?
I'm well. Thanks for having me tonight.
Absolutely. Thanks. And we also have Leah Nahmias. She is the Director of Programs at Indiana Humanities, a statewide organization that encourages Hoosiers to think, read, and talk. In her role, Leah designs smart yet fun programs that get Hoosiers to explore big ideas and take part in meaningful conversations. Welcome, Leah.
Thank you. Hi.
Hey. And we also finally have Jennifer K. Thompson. She is the Executive Director of Civil Squared, a nonprofit dedicated to getting unlike-minded people talking again. And she's the author of a weekly email newsletter highlighting civil approaches to issues in the news, and the host of a bi-weekly podcast where she interviews experts on these issues and how to make your conversations more productive. Welcome, Jennifer.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Of course. So, to get started here tonight, we thought it might be good just by defining sort of what a productive conversation is, and just kind of by starting there. If we're going to talk about productive conversations, we have to know what they are. And so, Jennifer, I think I may throw this one to you first. How could we define a productive conversation, and how would you set parameters for that?
I think that one of the things we forget when we talk about difficult conversations is that there is something conversations with people who don't agree with us. And so Tanya Israel, who's a psychologist who works on this and is, I think, one of the references that we have tonight, she talks about conversation as an opportunity, not a mandate, right? So you don't have to be involved in every conversation that presents itself, but the ones you are involved in, you ought to look at as an opportunity, and you ought to think about what it is that you hope to accomplish. And that can include understanding, that can include healing relationships, refining your own point of view. There's all different kinds of things that this opportunity presents to you. Winning, hopefully, is not the primary one, and maybe isn't even something that should be on the table if you really want to have a productive conversation.
I think, Justin, you're muted. Sorry.
Awesome, thanks. I was going to say, if anybody else wants to chime in there too, I also want to give you the opportunity as well. What is a productive conversation?
I think Jennifer raised a big point for me, which is the idea that, listening to understand, not to persuade. I think there's a time and a place for conversations that are about persuasion. I think that is the nature of politics, is trying to get people to join your side. But I think the kind of conversation that we're interested in talking about tonight isn't necessarily about persuasion. Or to be really intentional. I think this idea of being really intentional about the goals and purpose of a conversation going in, if your goal is to persuade, being honest about that aspect of what you're trying to do and making sure that the other person is on board for that same conversation. You don't want to invite someone into something expecting it to be a, let's heal a relationship, and it ends up in like, actually, I'm going to try to persuade you to my point of view. So I like that point.
I would add to that I think it's about understanding. So an argument or a debate is obviously different than a conversation like we've talked about. So if you're trying to find understanding, you can't find that through an argument or a debate. Understanding can only come about if you do sit down and have a productive conversation like we're talking about tonight. And that's not through argument, that's through trying to understand where someone is coming from and their perspective.
Yeah, and it sounds like there's a lot of intentionality, right, that goes into this. The idea of having those ground rules, having that set plan that's agreed on by both, or I say both, make it sound like there's only two, but maybe multiple people in the conversation, just to say that there's some kind of ground rules. Murdock, I know intentionality, and that's one thing that we've talked about a lot, that is something that's really important to have. How does intentionality factor into these productive conversations?
Absolutely. So my oratorical mentor says a text without context is merely a pretext for conning people. And when he said that, he meant if you take the situation, the word, the phrase, the conversation outside of the context in which it sits, wanting to grow some kind of education, maybe about building relationships, or maybe it has nothing at all to do with that, you will con yourself out of an incredible opportunity to know and to grow. And when you talk about a productive conversation, the first word is productive. The root of productive is to produce. We must grow. And so when you talk about intentionality and the relationship between intentionality and productive conversations, one, we need to be intentional about entering into conversations wanting to be productive. And everybody does not engage with the conversation wanting to be productive. And I think that whether we are the participant, we are the moderator, we are the viewer, be intentional and know the purpose of the conversation you're looking to enter. And when you understand that intention, I think it leads to less situations where that million straw breaks the camel's back, but we stop having those 999,999 straws sitting on top of that camel's back. The more intentional we are, the more productive we're going to become.
Absolutely. That's amazingly said. Very well said. And I wonder too as well about, Chris, there's sort of a setting for these conversations. When we create these ground rules, how should we think about setting, whether that setting is virtual or in person, or whether that setting maybe, if it is in person, do we do it while we're doing another activity, while we have something else to focus on, maybe? I don't know, what do you guys think about setting? Maybe, Leah, maybe I'll toss that one to you.
I'll just start by saying setting, I think, is really important. I think there's different ways to go about this. Like, I think the idea of making a meal together with someone and having a conversation, like something where there's a shared task and an activity, can absolutely work. I mean, it doesn't mean you go in without a plan and being, stating intentions, like stating your goals, like being deliberate about what questions you ask and how you are actively a listener. But I also think that I'm a big fan of having these kinds of conversations in person. I have a lot of doubt about, just complete skepticism that you can have a productive conversation on social media. And I know that we're all kind of living in a virtual world. And the nice thing about a virtual world is that you choose to show up and be present. Like, that is, you are opting, you are saying, I plan to be here. So those are a mixed bag of thoughts, but, avoid social media would definitely be advice.
Yeah. Any other thoughts there? Sorry, you don't have to. I just wanted to give everyone else an opportunity if you have one.
I do think, Leah's point on this, we work with a group called Make America Dinner Again, and the way they get people who disagree to take sort of the tension away at the outset is to make a meal together, because it's sort of, and when we do events, when we did things in person, we would have people down and eat together first, because we first approach that as, humanizing the other person, not just thinking of their point of view. But it's, Murdock's point is a really good one about intentionality. I think we if we care about the outcome of these conversations, we ought to be willing to put the time and effort in to making it something that we treat just as, just as importantly as lots of other things in our lives that we take the time to do.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, guys. And so it sounds like as we're sort of thinking about starting productive conversations with each other, from the very get-go, before the conversation even starts, there's work to be done in being intentional about what your goals are for the conversation, setting maybe ground rules with how you talk to each other, and also being very intentional about the setting and the place and the time where those conversations will happen. Anything else as far as pre-planning for the conversation?
I mean, I think there's some advice for what you do and don't do that you should kind of take before you get to the conversation. So one, I really think a great resource for this, there's a writer named Ijeoma Aluo, and I'm sure I'm saying her name wrong, and she has a book called So You Want to Talk About Race. And she has a lot of really good points. And one of hers is, don't ever use a term that, don't ever describe the person you're in a conversation with or their viewpoints with a term that they haven't used themselves. And I think that is like a really good piece of advice for how to have that conversation. So my point maybe here is that there are good ground rules out there that don't sound like school marmish, like, we're going to raise our hands in order to speak. Although, again, sometimes that is really important to state, especially if you have a group, right? But I think that you can look up different guides. And I know that that's one of the resources that Indiana Public Media has created for this event with these kinds of ground rules if you're looking for examples.
And a shameless plug here, I think that is actually number 2 on our tip sheet. So if you have that tip sheet available with a link somewhere on this Facebook feed here, it is number 2 on there.
Can I add one thing to that too?
Yeah, of course.
It's random, but it's relevant in that when you're talking about preparing for a conversation, know why you're going. Yeah. And I think something that we talked about just in preparation for this is just we're human beings, and we all have a capacity as well. And sometimes, and I know we'll talk about this a little bit later in terms of what responsibility do we have to educate in certain environments, and I'll definitely share my 2 cents there. But know that you're not a savior, and whether or not you go to this conversation will not determine whether or not it's going to be productive. And sometimes, whether it's in academia, whether it's in spaces like this, where we constantly engage in these kinds of conversations, this is not normal. And the extent to which sometimes we take what's not normal and normalize it, sometimes we ostracize the very people from becoming a part of a conversation that need to be a part of it. And sometimes just you being there is like, you know what, maybe this isn't a place for me, because the purpose of the conversation is greater than your comments, right? The purpose of the conversation is more than your comments. It's the fake of having the conversation. So I just wanted to add that as well.
And Aloha, on that point of being a savior or thinking of yourself as a savior, again, that goes back to you're not here to change bring someone into the light, right? If only they agreed with my point of view, the world would be better, and everything that's bad would stop. But Aloha talks about this idea, asking yourself, am I trying to do right or am I trying to do better, right? And I love that idea because I think it also suggests the very humanness of it, right? That we are trying to do better. There is no perfect, this is maybe my perspective, if we can each commit to do a little bit better each time and leave every interaction better, we may not solve all the things, but we're trying to do better. And as opposed to that kind of, am I trying to do right or do better? I find that really good advice to ask yourself.
No, that's great. It kind of sounds like, you don't necessarily have to leave it feeling like, oh my gosh, the sky has opened up and I've had this wonderful aha moment. It just has to be, maybe it doesn't even have to be just a little step in the right direction, right?
I think that's the work of religious leaders. Leave that work to people doing that. And then and you're just one-on-one, conversion experience isn't probably the work that you're trying to do in that conversation.
No, absolutely. And actually, we did get one Facebook comment that I want to bring up here real quickly. So someone asked, what if we do want to change someone's mind? What if our goal in entering in conversation is to persuade someone or to change someone's mind? What then? Any thoughts or tips there?
One thing I would say is, I mentioned Tanya Israel before, and she's on the sheet as well. One of the things she says is we really ought to be careful about overestimating our ability to change people's minds. And is the goal. I think one, you have to ask yourself, what's behind that goal? And also, is it something that can be done in one conversation? The odds of changing someone's mind probably improve with stronger relationships, and conversations improve relationships. Good conversations, productive conversations improve relationships. And so if you really do want to change someone's mind, it's probably best to imagine this as one step on a longer journey, as opposed to expecting that you can do it in one sitting.
Mm-hmm. I think I would add to that as well. It's also about your own learning experience. So we may go into a situation thinking, I'm going to change your mind, or I want to change your mind because I know that I'm absolutely right about this and you're wrong. And that leads to a debate. And as we've said earlier, this is more about conversation. But what I found, and this depends on how close you are to this person, and I think tonight we're looking more at if it's a loved one or a close friend having that conversation, but thinking about how deep you can go into that and how committed you are to maybe changing their mind, but also learning something along the way. So when we were preparing for this, we talked a bit about a trip that I took with my dad, which relates to my book that comes out next year, Hillbilly Queer. My dad is fairly conservative. He's a country boy. I'm not. I'm pretty liberal. I'm gay. And I wanted to know more about my dad's motivations. And so we took a road trip together at the height of the 2016 election to his hometown in rural Missouri. And it was a chance for me to step wildly into his world, to really see what his motivations were, what made him who he is, how I'm different. And that's not for everybody. But if there is somebody that you love and you want to try to see what their motivations are, what their experiences are, do that. Do it in a way where you're not arguing, but you're observing. And then you're better able to ask questions, to have a conversation. And then I think in return, ask them to step wildly into your world too, with that same respect. And that opens up dialogue when you're able to have those deeper experiences where maybe you will change their opinion about something and they might change yours as well. And so we have to go into this thinking that it's not always a one-sided situation. We may feel that way because I know I'm right about certain things. But I need to understand why somebody disagrees with me. And the way to do that is not to try to prove that I'm right.
That's great. It kind of sounds like if you want to change someone's mind, you also have to be open to the possibility of your own mind being changed in order for it to be a totally fair exchange in that sense. So,
I mean, to me, that's the idea of operating with some intellectual humility. And I just want to, that's a Jennifer Thompson phrase if there ever was one, but like, just, yes, the idea that you don't know everything. I would also say you are not, the person you're talking to is the expert of their own life experience, and you are not, no matter how well you think you know them. And I think that's like acknowledging the kind of dignity and respect of the other person. So, and then again, even if your stated goal isn't to change your mind, go in with it, open to the possibility that an exchange produces new learning for everybody.
Yeah, that's actually a perfect segue, I think, into so we've talked about sort of preparing for the conversation, right? And so now we're going to start, right? So now you make the first foray into conversation. In JR, I kind of want to start this off with you a little bit because you have a thing where you call it centering their story, right? It's sort of the way you think about this. What does that mean? And how do you start a conversation with centering a story?
Well, my approach is storytelling. So my organization, the Facing Project, is all steeped in storytelling. And the idea is to get people to sit down with one another, ask questions, learn from each other, and then write each other's stories from their perspectives to increase empathy about understanding across difference. And so when I talk about centering story, I can't insert myself right away in trying to get to know someone. So that goes back to this debate, or how do you try to prove to someone that you're right, or to get them to better understand your perspective. That can't start with an argument or a debate. It has to start with centering someone else's story. So when I enter into conversations, I want to know about them. I'm not going to really tell them much about me, but tell me more about like what brought you to Indiana, right? If you're new to Indiana, how do we start with some of these more centering their stories questions so we can learn more about them to go a little deeper? People love to talk about themselves, right? Even the most introverted people, when you start to dig, people love to talk about themselves. Often we don't love to hear other people talk unless they have something real profound to say. That's not always true, but I mean, people love to talk about themselves. So give them that opportunity, and you'll be surprised how much you can learn just by centering someone's story and asking them questions about their lives and their experiences.
Are there any good, not that you necessarily need like a stock question, right? Or maybe there's not one question that is perfect, but are there any good sort of starting questions if you just don't know where to start?
Well, I think that like JR is like he's using kind of a stand-in for a lot of like innocuous get to know you questions. And so like, what brought you here, right? Or like, who brought you here, right? Like trying to get to know someone's kind of world a little bit. I think maybe once you've gotten past that stage, a conversation prompt that, and I'll just credit Braver Angels, which is a national organization that works to bring people together specifically to talk across what they would call red-blue lines, and then also black-white lines. So they do a lot of work to train people how to have those conversations. They do trainings, and then they also allow people to sign up to be one half of one of those discussions. And I know they would love to have more people from Indiana participate in that program. But they have a question that I personally really like, and these are two different ones. Like, what principles or values kind of guide you generally, right? The Living Room Conversations Guide, which is another one of these kind of guides, has a similar phrase question. What sense of purpose, mission, or duty guides you? I love that because I think it's going to give you a real insight into someone's values, and what they see themselves, like what path they see themselves on. So I really love that. I would love to hear other examples from the other panelists too.
I think questions about your experience are important. I think not yes or no questions, open-ended questions are important. Not if you political thing, you don't want to ask someone, how could you possibly do X, Y, or Z? How could you possibly support this? How could you possibly believe this? And I think another really important thing to keep in mind is when you come into a conversation, you already know what you think probably, or you have some pretty solid sense of what you think. What you are going to learn in that conversation is what the other person thinks. And if you're somebody who feels very strongly about what you're saying and about the fact that you're right, you ought to challenge yourself to do two things. One, to listen really carefully. And two, I think to bring intellectual curiosity. How did come to, if they're like you, if they're somebody you care about, and you see them do good things, and you're kind of shocked that they have a different point of view, have intellectual curiosity about how they came to that point of view, and make sure your questions are around that, but in a way that respects the fact that you're trying to learn. Not
We may have lost her there for a second. You may have cut up there for very last little bit of that, Jennifer.
Oh, just that if you, if you are in conversation, then why, you owe it to yourself to spend some time listening and to try and understand the other person's point of view, I think.
Great. Thank you. Did you have thoughts there as well? I saw you.
I mean, I really don't know what else to say. I
Gotcha. Okay.
The other three panelists are doing great. I think if anything, it's a ditto times 3. And just remembering, I love what JR said about centering story. I talked about powerpreneurship. Powerpreneurship is about strategically leveraging the power in our stories. And so that's the realm through which I do quote unquote business. I don't believe in taking enterprise. I'm not an entrepreneur, I'm a powerpreneur. And I think that the greatest power we have is in our words. That's why our stories are powerful, because they're filled with words. And when we're able to have conversations predicated upon questions that are based on experiences, which come from our stories, we're able to actually have fruitful dialogue and we're able to move forward. Because again, I think it was Leah who said it when we talked before, why are you asking me questions that I can Google?
Yeah.
Like that doesn't make any sense. But when we're able to ask questions that actually say this conversation had a purpose, like if you walk away from a conversation and you like, I genuinely could have went to a website and got everything that came out of your mouth, you wasted your time, and that person wasted their time too. And I think that when you start conversations and you root conversations in stories, because just like JR said, we are experts in nothing else but in our stories. Right. And this is a tidbit. I got excited. When you center your conversation on story, you begin to have expert conversations. Yeah. And in the world in which we do, the best thing you can do is talk to an expert. Right. And so that's the tidbit. That's all I have to offer. That's
I would, going off of that, Human Library is a great example if you're familiar with their model. So Human Library is like literally checking out a story, but checking out a person and sitting down and having a conversation and working together, much like reading a book, using tell and describe questions to better understand. Again, some of these pieces take vulnerability, right? Much like the trip I took with my dad. But if you say, hey, I'm going to be a part of the Human Library, it is a place of vulnerability, but it's also a place to help people learn and understand. And so, going off of Murdock, I agree. I mean, of course, I love centering storytelling, but, I think it is around this tell, describe, and that's how people become experts. You're experts of your own story.
I want to add a couple thoughts really quick. One is just also thinking about the person who asked that question. Well, what if your goal is to change someone's mind? I would just say that, community organizing is a tactic which kind of has that political work built into it. It starts with storytelling too. It's just you can't overstate how foundational this is, because it's about how you build relationships. So that's really important. I also just want to point out, we said yes, no questions are like a no-no. Don't do that. And my God, don't start a conversation there, because then all someone's going to do is defend that point of view from the beginning. And it's that same with agree, disagree questions. Do you agree with X? I think that's not a particularly productive. Now, you might ask somebody, what experiences shaped your outlook about X, right? About healthcare, let's say, but not just do you think we should have private insurance versus government? I wouldn't start there, right? Allow that to emerge organically out of a conversation.
And I wonder too as well, sometimes we talk about these conversations that we're having, and I think in some people might be thinking of these in the context of a stranger, right? Or maybe someone that is an acquaintance, not necessarily someone they know very well. But that dynamic can also be very different when it's someone that you know very well, right? Like your own family member, your brother, your sister, your aunt, your uncle, JR, your dad, right? And so I'm kind of curious, and in fact, maybe I'll go to you, JR, to start with, sort of, any thoughts on how that dynamic changes when you're talking to someone that maybe you already know a lot about their life experience, at least the broad strokes, where they grew up, where they went to school, you have some rough idea already of where their experiences might be that have shaped their beliefs. Tell me, how does this dynamic change?
I think some people would argue that it's harder to have conversations with those you love because you're likely going to have to see them again. And sometimes it's easier just to say I'm not going to talk up to Aunt so-and-so about this because I'll have to see her at Thanksgiving, which likely won't happen this year, by the way. But, so I think some people will say that it's probably harder. I actually would argue against that. And I would say I think it's easier to start with people you love. Because with strangers, I think it's way easier to hop into an argument and a debate. But when you have people who you do love and that they made you part of who you are, you have to remind yourself of that. And to Murdock's point, you have to remind yourself that we're all human. We all have mistakes that we've made. We all have things that we've done that are really great. And none of us are above the other when it comes to that. And so we have to enter into these conversations from a human perspective, and that's done best when it's with somebody, if you can remind yourself who you love, even if they've done something that deep down you feel like you love them a little less than you did at one point. I think it's easier to actually have those conversations with people who you love. But again, you have to understand your own intentions going into that conversation. You have to create your own safe space around that. And if you feel like, I know I can't have a conversation with my dad about X, Y, and Z, because it will set him off the rails and there's no way that he could ever talk about that. You know that, you recognize that. And so that's probably not a good starting point for the conversation. But you likely can think and self-identify, who are people in my family who I love, perhaps we differ, that I could sit down and have a conversation with. And so again, going back to Murdock's point, other folks' point, it's about intentionality, and it's about human and conversation. And so I would argue that's best done with those who we do love.
And actually, something that you just brought up is a great segue to one of our viewer questions here, which is, are there any questions or topics that might be taboo in conversations? Any things that you should just plain out avoid? And I'm sure it's probably different for each context of, if you don't want to have a political conversation, maybe the political stuff would be taboo, vice versa. But any thoughts on that? Things that might be just patently taboo or wrong to talk about, per se?
I mean, I think constantly told not to talk about politics and religion, and I actually think that's a mistake. I think it isn't the case that thoughtful about how we have those conversations, and it's not that we shouldn't disagree. We should disagree productively. So I mean, it's hard for me to imagine, with the exception of things like JR pointed out. There are things about some people and in some circumstances that you probably shouldn't broach because it's not likely to be productive, or there may be some hurt there that you responsibly engage in dialogue about. But apart from that, I actually think you deepen relationships when you talk about things where you do have disagreement. And I think, and I'm going to say Murdock is probably the one who said this most recently to me, the importance of being uncomfortable. That's where we get growth, is from being uncomfortable and talking about things that are difficult.
Yeah, seeking out those moments of maybe dissonance, so that in order that we can learn from them.
Can I add something to that too?
Of course.
Just, and I'm not going to get too excited here, but the piece about, are there certain topics we shouldn't discuss? I think it goes back to, why are you talking? Like, I really think we need to, again, I'm not going to get that excited, but
you can.
Yeah, for sure. But then I'm gonna start yelling, then my Wi-Fi gonna break up. So I think one thing is, we have to go back to the root of why you're engaging in this conversation. And we have got to stop calling debates and arguments conversations. Debates and arguments are not naturally bad, but they are not conversations. A conversation is not rooted in trying to move somebody on a spectrum. A conversation is rooted in sharing a perspective. Here's the piece where it can get interesting. When me sharing my story begins to infringe upon you feeling as though you can share yours, there's a different kind of a problem there. And I don't think that's rooted in a productivity or lack of productivity. That may be rooted in trauma and in insecurity, which goes back to setting intentions in spaces and places and regulations and rules for conversations. And someone's listening, brother, I don't feel like setting those many intentions, rules, and regulations with folks that I meet at a Walmart. Well, that's maybe because as a culture, we've not been as intentional as necessary about having conversations. Point blank, period. And to what extent have we normalized debates and arguments, so much so that we confuse debates and arguments for conversations? So that's the first thing I say. The second thing I say is, when my story and me sharing, and I'm getting passionate because I'm a 24-year-old Black man from Indianapolis, Indiana, right? And I understand the platform I'm sitting on right now, sitting in this moment, in this movement to make Black Lives Matter more, being led by Black women, being led by Black trans folks, being led by Black non-binary folks, and understanding that this pandemic called COVID-19 has a disproportionate impact on particular groups of people. And it would be wrong of me not to be on this platform and speak truth to power. Because when you speak truth to power, it's not for the person that's speaking, for the person that's listening. That's the person who seeks freedom and feels freedom. And when I speak my truth in a room, and simply my truth and story makes you feel uncomfortable, that's not my problem. That's not my problem. And too often you have people whose stories, and a certain demographic of people whose stories themselves are being policed. And sometimes you simply proclaiming your agency is sometimes we have situations where some people's truths interrupt some people's idea of who they are. And that's not the problem of whose truth it is. That's a problem with the community in which we live. And we've got to stop punishing people for speaking their truth. I am Black, I am proud, I am young, and I'm from Indianapolis, Indiana. And me saying that in no way disenfranchises, in no way discriminates against, in no way disembodies what makes you who you are. And me saying who I am doesn't make you any less. And if it does, that is not my problem. And I did not make this a debate or an argument. I'm simply having a productive conversation, and productive conversations produce, they grow. And what are those things? Uncomfortable. So I'm off my soapbox, but again, I think that's important.
Now you want to throw out like some tips for what to do if a conversation, I would say, gets hot, right? And I think that sometimes, I mean, so there's certain kinds of tips you would give to a facilitator if they're like formally facilitating a group conversation versus maybe, but I think some of these tips can work for one-on-one. I think it's sometimes, first of all, pay attention to nonverbal cues, right? Like, my God, like, is someone making eye contact? Are they, you can tell a lot about how someone's feeling in a conversation. Pay attention to your own emotions in a conversation. If you're starting to feel defensive, ask yourself why, right? Don't tone police. That's another rule, and I think that's a really good one. But I also think about I think sometimes it's okay to say it sounds like that question isn't something that you want to answer right now, and I think that's okay. Let's redirect. Let's pivot to something else. Don't force. I just think don't force the conversation, and respect someone who's kind of giving you either verbal or nonverbal cues that they don't feel comfortable answering that question at that moment. Because I think ultimately you want to be able to have a conversation with someone again, right? You don't want to foreclose the possibility of ever having a conversation. So I just think I always tell facilitators, acknowledge, you can just say, hey, that's on me. I asked the wrong question. It's not on you, right? It's on me. And I want to change gears or change direction.
Mm-hmm. That's great. And actually, Leah, I wanted to also bring up something too that I know you feel really strongly about, right? Which is, we've talked a lot about sort of when things get bumpy, right? When things maybe don't go super well. But I don't want that. I don't want to set the expectation that you're going to try to have a conversation and things won't go well, right? What about when things when you actually find out that oh my gosh, we really agree on this thing? There was a story that I did not too long ago where I knew two people who were very polar political opposites. Found that they actually agreed on something on immigration issues and things like that. And it was an amazing moment for the two of them. So, Leah, I know you feel strongly about this, and I'm sure other people do too, but what do we do when we have those moments of congruity?
So I think first of all, name it. Wow, we actually agree on this. If you feel surprised about that, I'm kind of surprised, but this is exciting, right? Name it, acknowledge it, celebrate it maybe. Right? That is a point of commonality. I think a lot of guides talk about I'm a former teacher, so I would call this metacognition, right? Just thinking on your thinking or reflecting on the conversation. And so as you're getting towards the end of a conversation, can you start to kind of say, what did I hear the other person say about the things about their perspective? Did they give a reason for why they believe what they believe that has anything in common with why I believe what I believe, right? Try to, if both of you can kind of do that, you might bring out something new in the conversation by kind of saying I heard you say this, it really reminded me of something that motivates me. And could we talk a little bit more about that? That's one of the things that kind of comes to mind for me, is that kind of reflecting on the conversation together and kind of figuring out if you raise things in common, and again, maybe what you raised is that we both care about we may solve that problem in different ways. That's politics, right? Like, but like the value or belief that motivates your engagement around that issue may be something that you actually have a lot in common. So
yeah,
I'd love to hear others on this.
Yeah, I would agree with that 100%. I think celebrate that moment, because that is an opportunity to go deeper, and you may find that you're actually more alike than you knew. And I think we all actually have more in common than we do not in common. So, this goes back to psychology and neurology and looking at mirror neurons. And this idea that we are hardwired for empathy. We're hardwired for trying to understand each other. Not everyone. We know that there are a small percentage of our population that they're not. They're sociopaths and they don't have empathy. But we're mainly hardwired for empathy. That's why babies cry in nurseries. It's a mirror neuron. They see a baby cry, they cry in response to that. You yawn, I yawn. And so we actually have way more in common than we ever want to believe. And over time, we build up these different belief systems that separate us and make us think that we don't. And so I think in those moments when we do find a commonality, we celebrate that. It's a chance to dig deeper, to find more ways that we're in common. Because hopefully, right, an end goal, I think, is not totally winning a debate if it gets into a debate, but it's rather how we're alike and how we can have even deeper, more productive conversation.
Yeah.
I also think about what happens, like sometimes, and Jennifer kind of introduced this idea at the beginning, sometimes you come out of a conversation having more clarity about your own perspective.
Yeah.
And I think you can thank a person for that. I think that's like a respectful way to say, I just want to thank you. Like, this conversation helped me understand something about myself differently, or clarified my thinking about this. And I've had that experience in conversations where I was like, this was productive for me thinking. And just, I think you can thank someone for helping you come to that point.
Yeah, I think at the very least, how often do we have a chance to verbalize sometimes our own experiences? And sometimes the words come out of our mouths and we think, oh my gosh, I didn't even know that I felt that way until that word just came out of my mouth, and there it is, and it's staring me right in the face. It's right in front of me, which may be a good thing or a bad thing, And Murdock, when we talk about the kind of the congruity here, right? Well, people agreeing on things. I know with talking about being a powerpreneur, right? You talk about storytelling in a lot of ways, and you use these kind of economic words almost to describe storytelling, and I think what's kind of cool too is when I think about this in like an economic sense, a lot of businesses are built around the fact of, here's a person who has a need, I have a service, connect the need to the service, and you've unlocked something, right? You've unlocked a business.
Come on now, Justin, you better teach somebody something today. Come on, Justin.
right. I'm about to lay it down here. I mean, what do you think about that? Is that kind of what it hinges upon, this powerpreneur idea?
Yeah, so I think the powerpreneur idea is more than what we're talking about today. But I think in this context, like there's a quote I give, right? We must make it make sense so we can make sense, and sensational impact all across the senses. And when you're talking about these moments of congruity, I think that's here.
Yeah.
But in order to get here, you have to do this first, right? And I think that goes back to intention setting. It goes back to what kinds of questions are you asking? It goes back to why are you a part of the conversation? And it goes back to you being honest with yourself and saying, what do I really want to get from this? Because we also got to be real. Like, this is a beautiful conversation. It's dope. But we're also humans with flaws and with trauma. And sometimes we try and deal with our trauma through conversations. And that's not the space for that sometimes. And we just have to be real about it. And so we can't get here unless we're honest and true about this, right? And then when you talk about, right, this relationship between how businesses, again, one of the hottest button words right now is storytelling in a number of different spaces. The ability for a business to be able to say, I'm not just Excel spreadsheets and revenue streams, but this business started somewhere, right? Especially small businesses. And you see more specifically, businesses founded by Black women across this country, but especially in Indianapolis, that are really diving deep into that. The fact that the barriers I experienced in starting my business, and not even just starting my business, but waking up in the morning and believing I have an idea that's worth investing in, is a story. And so before you even get to talk about your business model or your portfolio, People are sold on investing in who? Investing in you, right? When someone hears, I'm gonna give a shout out because I think I'm supposed to because we're on a platform. When someone hears Kelly Jones, right, one of the co-founders of Be Nimble, before you get to hear about the great work that Be Nimble is going to be doing for Black entrepreneurs across the Midwest, you hear about the trials and tribulations that Kelly Jones experienced to get to where she is now, and truly making history across this country of being a product of this city. And so when you talk about these moments of congruity, what happens is she, like so many other folks, are able to walk into rooms and say, before I pitch to you this portfolio, let me give you an opportunity to see my story. And when we're able to leverage the power in our story, even when it gets gory, it leads to profit surely. And the profit I profess is not about the change in our pockets, but about the change we can make in our community. And that's what I mean by making it make sense, so we can make sense and sensational impact across the senses. And when we're able to be intentional about what conversations we enter and why, because I want to be in a conversation for moments of congruity, right? We're able to make that sensational impact. But if I'm coming in there with the wrong intention, I may have moments of congruity, but I'm so affixed on making sure I get my point across, which is not a conversation, that's a debate or an argument, you miss it. And no sensational impact is made. And you're broke and you're not making any sense. So, and that's a lose-lose-lose for everybody.
Yeah. I mean, that just reminds me of what I've heard at every single pitch competition I've ever witnessed, which is where they say people don't invest in products, they invest in ideas, they invest in stories, they invest in people, right? Yeah, absolutely. So, okay, recapping here for people who may have just joined us. So we're talking about, difficult conversations, how to have them. And we've been talking sort of, for the last 15, 20 minutes so far, right, about when you are in the middle of a difficult conversation, some of the tips, right? And just kind of those baseline tips, right? As far as sort of what to do. Open-ended questions, questions that kind of speak to the values or the principles that guide you. It's questions that speak to your experience and how your experiences shape those values. And also taking time to sort of reflect on the things that are maybe going well and the things that are not going well, and the things that are not going well, reading body language, things like that, just being aware that all those things are happening. Any other, tips as far as that goes, just kind of like where the rubber meets the road, do this, don't do that, maybe?
And one thing I think is really important is about listening and active listening. And I think Tanya Israel, one of the things she says is it's more important to be present, simply be present, than to be brilliant. Sometimes when we're in the midst of a difficult conversation, we get hung up on waiting for the person to stop speaking because we have something we want to get in. Mm-hmm. If you, again, kind of challenge yourself to say, what I get to say next, I'm going to listen carefully and I'm going to be present, as opposed to thinking about how smart I can look or how right I can be at the end of this. I think that goes a tremendous way towards improving the productivity. And I think, JR, maybe you were saying that people like to talk about themselves. There's almost nothing you can do to make a conversation more likely to be successful than to be an active listener.
Yeah. And I love that. And I was thinking about it, like that's the difference between a debate. Like a debate, you are not listening, you're not present, you're thinking about what your next argument is going to be. You're thinking about the next point you want to bring up. If you're a certain kind of debater, you've come with your talking points ready to go, right? So I just am really struck by the profundity of that as a general principle.
And I would just add, Murdock, I would just add that silence is okay. So oftentimes we're uncomfortable with silence, especially if we're in a conversation and it's a deep conversation. Silence sometimes might signal to us, I've upset this person, but that may not always be the truth. I mean, silence sometimes is reflection, and reflection is a piece that I think we miss oftentimes in conversations because we're not good at, as humans, I don't think we're often good, or we've unlearned how to reflect in the moment, which often takes small moments of silence to think about why I feel this way, right? Or in this conversation, we may have unpacked something about myself that feels really uncomfortable. And to Murdock's earlier point, that's up to me. That's on me to figure out that uncomfortableness. It's not up to the person I'm having the conversation with. And that takes silence, because that takes reflection. So silence is not always bad.
Just wanted to say two quick things, right? One, to what Leah just said, an incredible point, right? Distinguishing between a conversation and a debate. Here's the wild part. And this is someone who's in law school. Before I got on here, shout out to my law of nonprofit organizations class. I won my oral argument, right? And I'm not going to talk about what I was arguing because I just learned it for that class. Kind of forgot what I was supposed to be talking about. But now that we're here, I can say a great debater, and that movie, The Great Debaters, was an incredible movie. If you haven't watched it, by the way, you should watch it. But great debaters are also incredible.
Add that to the tip sheet. Yeah.
Yes, but they're also incredible listeners. The best debaters are able to understand their purpose in their argument. When you make a better argument when you know what the person before you actually said. That's the deep part. Because in a debate, here's the other thing about a debate. When you're debating, typically there's a third party that decides who they do and don't agree with. But again, we're not going to go there. But I wanted to add that, like, even in moments of distinguishing between conversations and debate, you still need to practice active listening. And I know that Jennifer was talking about that too, but Leah mentioned earlier, nonverbal communication. That's the majority of communication. The majority of communications don't even happen like this. As much as we be talking, especially on Zoom during the pandemic, majority of conversations don't even happen like this. That's part of the reason why trying to have critical conversations on social media is a problem, because you can't hear nobody talking. You can't see nobody. And that's crucial to the majority of conversation. The last thing I'll mention, to go back to what JR said, I think you're absolutely right. In a conversation, people need time to reflect. My mama taught me that, right? My mother taught me that. And she taught me that through two ways. One, by telling me you need to listen, but also by watching her being silenced in certain conversations. She had no option but to listen. And it was when she was able to listen, and wasn't even listening, she was being silenced. She was able to make such profound points that when she opened her mouth, people had no choice but to listen. So sometimes the folks who have no option but to be silenced, when they open their mouth, what they say is so profound, we have no other option but to listen, right? And so shout out to Black women. The other thing though is silence is not bad in conversations. But we also understand that silence is violence in other kinds of places and spaces. Yeah. And sometimes not using your voice and sometimes not sharing your story aids in problems. Because I think that another one of those tips on that sheet is always being aware in conversations of who is not in the room. And sometimes you need to speak and you need to share, not to debate, not to argue, not to prove a point, but because somebody's perspective has never been represented. And their perspective and story should be represented in that room because there's something to learn from their story. So I just wanted to add that too.
That's great. This is all actually bringing back a lot of metaphors that I'm remembering now from so before I was in journalism, I was going to be a professional musician and spent a lot of time in orchestras. And one of the things that conductors say all the time, a thing that I heard all the time was listen louder than you play. Right. In order to actually be a productive member of an 100-member orchestra, you have to be listening more than you're thinking about what you are about to play. So that really brings that up for me. And also, too, when we talk about silence being great as well, the whole adage as well of, music is what happens, in between the notes. Right. The idea that rests are just as important in any musical piece, as the actual sound itself. Without the rests, the sound has no meaning. So I'm just thinking, man, like these metaphors are really just firing for me right now. So, okay, so I also so let's imagine now too, moving on from we've pre-planned our conversation, we've had our conversation, and things have maybe gone well and not gone well, and a mixture of all in between, I'm sure. Let's say, okay, now we're shaking hands, we're walking away, we're leaving grandma's house after Thanksgiving turkey, whatever the case is. This is sort of that reflection time, right? What do we do after the conversations, right? Because the work's not done once the conversation is over, I'm sure. So, Jennifer, what do you think? What do we do after the conversation ends?
I think it depends on how the conversation ends. I think if it has gone well. I think it's worth following up and saying thank you. Thank you for the time. Thank you for the listening. Thank you for the effort you put in. If the conversation has gone well, but you want to revisit something, or it's gone well enough that you wanna think about another topic, invite that person again to something that's carefully thought out. You don't do it sort of on the fly, and you think about the circumstances, and have that conversation again. And if it hasn't gone well, I think it's okay. And I absolutely think it's okay when conversations are not going well and people are losing their tempers, to stop those conversations and to say, we're not moving forward. Let's come back to this. Let's revisit it, or this is not the right time to do it. To send an invitation or think through how it went, think through what you can do to change that outcome, or do the best you can to change the outcome. And again, revisit your own intentions. Did it actually have a result of this? But what did you learn? And again, I think you cannot say enough, be grateful for that time and for the understanding that you hopefully have gained, and the connection and the relationship. I think those are really important things.
I will say, like, if the conversation doesn't go well, a couple of other things, like, don't beat yourself up, right? Like, apologize, but like, you know, I like this advice. It's from the Braver Angels Network, but like, remember, it's worth the risk and commit to trying again, right? Like, I mean, on some level, this is about how we repair our civil society, right? Like, or our families. I can't think of, if I were ordering those things, which comes first and which comes second, but they're really important. And so it is absolutely worth doing and trying, even if it doesn't go well. And I would say, the less you can have, like, for a vision of like, it will be perfect if I change this person's mind. I mean, like, go in with just kind of like being present, right? Part of being present is kind of saying, we're going to see what happens during this conversation.
And
yeah, like an experiment. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I just would add that it's probably nothing will change probably in one conversation. So if you're having a difficult conversation, I mean, it is about the learning, the understanding, and getting to re-know each other. And that's probably not going to happen in an hour if you're sitting down. And so it does take a commitment. And so for the instance with my dad, our original trip together was 4 years ago, and we're still learning and we're still working through our kinks of our differences. So this doesn't happen overnight. Solving our division in our country, solving our differences, that's not going to happen. So you just have to go into it knowing that your initial conversation is not going to be the end of it.
One more thing to that, and it really goes back to something that Jennifer said too. In addition to thinking about what to do after, depending upon if it went well or it went bad, like that having an impact on what you do after, I think we also need to acknowledge it also depends on what kind of a conversation it was, right? So if I'm at the Rock Fresh Market, right, and I see Joyce, who lives across the street from me, I just never talked to her before. We have a conversation while I'm getting my fresh produce, and she's picking up her whole grain rice, if that's even a thing. I don't know. I just made it up on the spot. We likely did not have an extensive conversation about A, B, C, and D. So that means I don't need to respond to that conversation the same way that I would if we're on Zoom right here. Like, there's going to be a difference. Why do I bring it up? Because independent of whether or not I'm at the Rock Fresh Market talking to Joyce about whole grain rice, or I'm on a Google Meet with 4 major companies talking to 4 esteemed individuals, you know what I can do regardless? Is I can take time to think about, what did I learn? Because that's something that I can control. I can't control what the other person does. You know what I'm saying? It's up to them. Matter of fact, I don't even know what I came to the conversation. They could tell me, they could share it, but all I can do is control me. And what I can definitely do walking away from a conversation is think about, okay, Mr. Murdock, Brother Murdock, what did you learn? Right? To what extent did the person say something that you haven't heard before? Or to what extent, like has been said earlier, did they affirm what you believed? To what extent did you say something where it's like, you know what, I didn't think I could move from this, but I can now? Or where it's like, I'm glad I had the conversation because I ain't never gonna ever agree with something like that, right? And I think when we do that, we are able to produce future conversations because we become more confident in our stories. And if conversations are supposed to be about sharing, not proving or persuading, then the better we're able to reflect and think about the impact that we had in the previous conversation, it's going to help us have a future conversation that's fruitful and productive in the future.
Yeah. One listener question that we got, and in fact, this sort of fits in maybe a little bit with what you were saying, Murdock, is the idea of, well, what do you do when someone is kind of spouting conspiracy theories, right? Or saying things that we don't necessarily think are rooted in their experience or even in fact. You know, I think we want to believe that all these conversations that we're having are going to be, you know, based upon all of our personal experiences, and that we would all honor those ground rules and things. But you know, what do we do when people are coming from places that we don't even necessarily think are true? What then?
2 points, real quick, because I know everybody got something to say about this. One, I'm gonna go back to what Leah said when we chopped it up before this conversation. Having conversations and debating things, arguing things, conversing about things that Google can answer, I think is a void point, because you can go and Google that. We can spend time talking about things that can't be found on Google. So that's my first piece. And if it's a matter that whether it's a conspiracy theory or you think it's a conspiracy, but they think it's truth, which is also a different conversation for a different day. Conversation is the word I used intentionally, not a debate or an argument. That's a conversation for a different day. Then we need to make clear, goes back to intention, make clear what basis you're saying what you're saying upon, right? And I'm not going to go and take JR's point, because I'm sure JR got a great point he made, because he made it before. But I think it's important to know why you say what you said and share what that is. And maybe we'll find this conversation is difficult because we're coming from two completely different premises, right? And if we find from different premises, maybe it's not time for a convo. You have a little argument. An argument's not negative. Little debate. Debate's not negative. But are we ready for that? Do we want to have that? Last thing I'll say, when you find that moment in conversation where premise seems to be the difference, it's not a matter of experience or opinion, but it's what seems to be a factual premise, right? I think there's two things to keep in mind. One, know whether or not you need to leave, right? Because sometimes, and I'll be frank, I believe that Black Lives Matter, right? This idea of all lives matter, that is something that I think is predatory. I think it's problematic for a lot of different reasons. And there's going to be a certain point where if I'm engaging with someone who believes that all lives matter and refuting that Black Lives Matter, guess what I know, Justin? I need to leave that conversation. And guess what? That's me. There may be someone else who can have that, but I know for me and myself, I need to leave that conversation, because that's going to turn into a debate and an argument, and I don't want to hurt nobody's spirit, and I don't want mine to be hurt either, right? So know how to leave. Second thing I'll say is everyone does not have a responsibility to educate, right? This idea of a teacher, no matter how underpaid teachers are, teachers get paid. I'm not being paid in this environment to teach you. And that doesn't mean a check or the cents. We need to really, really think about that. So again, when you're talking about we're debating, it seems to be based on conspiracy theories, things that are facts or not facts. Be clear about the premise of your argument, right? And if you find that there's a difference in factual premise, know whether or not you need to leave, or if you have the energy to educate. And sit in that, don't be ashamed of that, and move forward accordingly.
Yeah. You know, I would add, we have to know our boundaries, like Murdock said, what we're willing to get into and not get into. I guess as far as conspiracy theories, this goes back to access in some ways. You know, education is a beautiful thing, but education is not always free. So we don't always have equal access to education or resources. And because of that, what we know can differ. And unfortunately, that could mean a conspiracy theory is something that somebody actually believes is fact. And so while I may have multiple resources to prove why that's wrong, that I could say, well, you should see such and such author or read this article, the fact of the matter is they're probably not going to. And that's going to end the conversation there. They'll likely go on and still believe that conspiracy theory. So part of this is an art, too. And you have to know how to get these resources and factual information into the conversation without explicitly pointing out this fact or resource, but say something like, well, that's interesting. I've not heard that, but from my experience, X, Y, and Z. And that's a better starting point, I think, to have a conversation with somebody who's throwing up false information or conspiracy theory information. But back to Murdock's point, I really think if it's something that does not feel safe or that you know you're going to fly off the rail about. So for instance, somebody who identifies as a gay man, if somebody starts the conversation saying, I don't think you really can be gay, I think you can be changed, that's probably not a good starting point of conversation with me. And I know that I would need to take multiple deep breaths and steps back before I proceed. So you have to check your own boundary of what you're comfortable with. But if it's something you're comfortable with and they're throwing out false points, I really think trying to step back in a moment and understand that they may not necessarily have access to certain resources or know the information out there, but how you don't lead with the resources. We're not writing a dissertation here. We're having a conversation. So how do you work that in a way that you're saying, well, for my experience, X, Y, and Z, and you're not necessarily saying, see this author or this organization or yada, yada, yada.
So I will say, I do think it's okay sometimes to say, like, here's something I read that shaped my viewpoint on this, or here's something I read that helped me understand an issue. And like, so even maybe they're not going to go, pull it up, but I do think it's like, I have ideas about things because I haven't experienced them, because I have read something, right? And how I decide whether something is authoritative and worth, shaping my viewpoint. I don't think that's always bad to introduce into a conversation. And I think there's a point where you might say, I really disagree, but here are some things I read that shaped the why I think about it. I also, occurs to me while we were having this, like, I don't know, like, what if one of the ground rules you said at the beginning of the conversation is like, we agree not to cite anything that we saw on Facebook, right? Like, what would happen in a conversation if you like set that as a ground rule? It might eliminate some of that noise. I don't know. It might be worth trying anyway.
Well, thank you so much, guys. I think we are about out of time here, but I might go around and kind of give everyone, your 1 or 2 sentence closing statement here on just sort of, why is this important, and just kind of reiterating here why it's important to have difficult conversations. JR, founder of the Facing Project, the co-founder of the Facing Project and co-host of the Facing Project radio show. What's your 1 or 2 sentence pitch here? Why are difficult conversations important to have?
I mean, I think this is more important than ever. I mean, if you look at our country as a whole, some people are citing that we're the most divided we've been since the Civil War. And so we have to start having difficult conversations. And I think if we go in with intentionality, centering stories, listening, that's a starting point. But we definitely have to get there because, I mean, there's no doubt. Everywhere we look, we are completely divided. But going back to my point about mirror neurons, we're more alike than we actually want to recognize. And so we need to just go back to centering stories and having a conversation.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, JR. And thanks for joining us tonight. Murdock, you're founder of Murdock LLC and co-founder of Power Moves. What do you think? Why is this important?
Important for a lot of different reasons that I'm sure everybody else is going to say. But what I'll say is, doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result is a definition of insanity. And we've seen a lot of insanity for a long time, and it's time to do something different. If nothing else, do something different. And what's different is having difficult conversations. I think that's my first sentence. My second sentence is, I try and always use my platform. I've been able to share my story. People appreciate my story, and it gives me a platform to share it with other people. So I try and intentionally use my platform to benefit others. So I have to say this is a Black-owned brand, the Carter brand based out of Atlanta. This is a Black-owned brand based out of actually in Indianapolis in the 219, the region called We Don't Run. And this is a Black-owned brand based out of North Carolina called Spring Break. Again, for me, knowing my platform, knowing the power of my story and leveraging that power, that's what it means. It means bringing people into rooms that they don't currently exist. And I'm thankful to have given this platform. I understand that folks like me deserve to be on platforms like this. And I refuse to occupy it alone. I choose to share it and create more conversations. So thank you for this opportunity.
No, absolutely. Thank you for being here. You've been very powerful. Thank you so much. Leah Nahmias, she's the director of programs at Indiana Humanities. What's your 1 or 2 sentence pitch here?
I think we have to do this work because we have to govern ourselves, and I think we have to we have the and I think a lot about. Midwesterners have ideas about it's impolite to have these kinds of conversations. There is a survey that's done called the Hoosier Civic Health Index, and Hoosiers don't vote. We have very, very low rates of civic participation. There are other kinds of civic participation that we also are not good at. We have lower rates of contacting elected officials, going to public meetings, kind of weighing in on issues. But we also, and I find this really interesting, we have very low rates when they ask questions about, do you talk about politics around the dinner table? Do you talk about the news? And Hoosiers have very low rates on that. And I'm not surprised at all. I think we have to have these conversations because I think they are linked to civic health.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Leah. And last but not least, Jennifer Thompson, Executive Director of Civil Squared, a nonprofit dedicated to getting unlike-minded people talking again. What's your pitch?
My pitch is that I think all of us tonight talking know that it's easier to talk about having difficult conversations than it is to do. So one, know that we all understand that that's a tough thing to do. But two, I don't believe that the world gets better because of top-down solutions. I believe the world gets better because of human creativity and innovation. And I think that in order to capitalize and magnify individual creativity and innovation, we have to work together, and we have to work together in collaboration. And the only way to do that is to improve our relationships with one another. So I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that the future depends on being able to talk to one another about difficult things, and it's hard, but it is absolutely worth it because it will make the world a better place. And I'm not somebody who says things like that routinely or lightly. I think it's really, really important.
Well, if that doesn't build the case for you right there, I don't know what will. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us tonight. I'm Justin Hicks with Indiana Public Broadcasting, and as always, we would love to hear your thoughts and questions. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, wherever you want, and would love to hear from you. And again, thank all of you for having this conversation tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, everyone.